Hi guys, welcome back to the home and homestead. My name is Rebecca, and today on the homestead we'll be doing part 2 of a multi-part series of hearty soups and rustic breads. And today we'll be making a rustic Italian bread. There's nothing better than a hearty soup or a rustic bread. These are great comfort food and cozy for lunch or dinner. They're perfect on a cold fall or winter day. So follow along and see how we make this rustic Italian bread. So first, for making the bread, what you want to do is get 1 cup of water and heat it up. I place it in the microwave. Usually takes about 40 seconds in our microwave. And you want it to reach about 100 to 110 degrees. So right there. And to that we will add 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, or you could add a packet of yeast. You want to use active yeast for this. To that we will add 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and 1 teaspoon of sugar. And the sugar helps to feed the yeast. So what we're going to do is stir the yeast into this warm water with the oil and the sugar, and we'll set it aside and we'll let this yeast bloom. Usually takes about 5 minutes. What will happen is the yeast will eat the sugar and it'll start to become kind of a frothy layer on top of your water. Now we'll move on to the dry ingredients for this bread. So in this large bowl I have 3 cups of flour. You can use 2 1/2 to 3 cups of flour for this rustic Italian bread loaf. That all depends on the moisture level in the flour as well as in the environment to which you're cooking. So I have 3 cups in here. To this we will add 2 teaspoons of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of salt. And what I like to do is mix the salt and sugar into the flour a little bit. Now we'll wait for the yeast to bloom. I'll put it under the camera. You can see it already is eating, and actively it was just bubbling. I moved it so it unsettled it, but I'll set this off to the side. Alright, so it's been about 5 minutes, and as you can see on the top of the yeast here, the yeast water mixture, the yeast has bloomed and there's a nice thick froth on the top. So now what we're going to do is add the yeast mixture into the flour mixture that we have. Now let's mix this together. Now if you find that your dough is rather dry, you can add a little more water. If it's too moist, you can add a little more flour. That's why I said the range of 2 1/2 to 3 cups. So now we're going to turn this out onto a floured surface. A little more water. Now we're just going to gently mold this into a ball. Okay, now we're going to put this back into the bowl. Some olive oil. I just put some in the bowl and then I smooth it around the edge of the bowl. And then I just put it in here and we'll cover it with a towel. And we'll let this rise for 30 minutes and then we'll come back and check how it looks. Okay, so for this rustic Italian bread, you can do what's called a second rise. So earlier today, I started another bread, and I have this in a bowl, and it's risen, it's about double in size. So what you want to do is you want to punch it down. You can hear the air kind of squish out of it. And then you cover it back up, and we'll let it rise again for another 30 minutes to an hour. So I have 1 rustic Italian bread doing just a single rise today, and then I have one that will do a double rise today, and then you can see the difference. All right, we'll let these continue to rise. Now back to the single rise rustic Italian bread. This has been rising for about an hour. It has doubled in size. See nice air bubbles in here. So what we're going to do is place this onto a flat or a cookie sheet, some parchment paper on. I'm going to gently put this onto the tray here. And it's roughly to a oval or oblong shape already. Just kind of guide it to the shape I want. So here we're going to do a few steps that are optional. I have what's called a bread lame. So it's a little very sharp razor that attaches to a handle, and you can make different patterns on the top of your bread. And the purpose of that is so that when the bread cooks and expands in the oven, it helps the bread to have a nice crispy outer edge and have that nice crusty bread that you're looking for. So what I'm going to do is make a pattern on here. Since this is the single rise, I think I'll just do one curvilinear line on here. You can also use a kitchen shears and just make a bunch of diagonal lines, or you could use a really sharp knife and do whatever pattern you'd like. Depending on how deep you are, depends how much that loaf will expand. You'll see loaves of bread with these really wide, beautiful shapes, and that was likely created by a bread lame or a knife or something like that before they bake it. Now, I also like to spritz my breads before I bake them. Not all, but typically when I do my sourdoughs and things like that, I like to do a little micro mist of water. It has a similar effect to if you do an egg wash on rolls and things like that. But you'll see me do that more often when I do my sourdough breads with you guys. That's actually where I received this bread lame, was in a kit with Banneton baskets that I use when doing my sourdough breads. So what I do is just do a quick spritz of water on top. Then we'll put this into the oven. I have the oven preheated to 375 degrees. I like to use a oven stone, which I'll show you inside of the oven. I have the oven preheated with the stone in there. If you do not have an oven stone, that's perfectly fine. You can just use a cookie sheet, or if you have a pizza stone, that works well too. And I like the parchment on for transferring onto the stone, and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so in the oven you can see the oven stone. It's all preheated to 375 degrees. So we'll pull the rack out. We'll just slide the bread onto the stone on the parchment. We'll close this. And this will take about 20 to 25 minutes to bake. After a few minutes, I'll go in there and I'll remove the parchment paper so that the bread will just be resting on the stone. Okay, this has been baking for just a few minutes, so let me open the oven here. Just slide it off. We'll shut it again, let it keep cooking. Now it'll cook directly on the stone, and that'll help get it a nice crusty outside to the bread. All right, so the single rise rustic Italian bread, it's been baking for 20 minutes. So let's check it out here. It's a nice golden color on the top, but how you test, if you tap it on the bottom, it has a nice hollow sound, which it does. If you want a little more golden brown, you can keep this baking. So I'll just cook it for maybe 3 more minutes, just to get a little more crispy brown on the top. All right, so the additional couple minutes has finished. It has a nice golden brown color now. So just remove from the oven. Close that. We'll get this on a cooling rack. So here's the single rise rustic Italian bread on the cooling rack here. Nice hollow tap on the bottom, and just a thin skive there with the lame. That allowed it to expand in that area. All right, now let's do the second rise loaf of bread together. So for the second rise, we'll use the cookie sheet or flat with a small piece of parchment paper on there. Here is the loaf here. Kind of guide it to the shape that I want. You can also do, if you've ever seen the fancy loaves of bread and they have the little flour kind of sprinkling on top, you just put a light dusting of flour, and that also helps the lame blade glide a little smoother on the bread while you make your cuts. So since this one is a double rise, I'm going to do a double cut. And the shape's a little different too. All right, let's get this in the oven. Alright, so the double rise rustic Italian bread loaf has been baking for about 28 minutes total. Has a nice golden brown color and a nice hollow tap when you tap the bottom. So we'll put this on the cooling rack with the other loaf. We'll take a closer look. Alright, so here we have our 2 loaves of rustic Italian bread. Here we have the single rise loaf that we did first, and this is the double rise that we did second. Now what you'll notice is there is a different appearance to the loaves of bread. So if you have the time to do the second rise, I would recommend doing it. It does give a more complex and a little bit of a nicer bread. However, this is still a really nice rustic Italian bread to enjoy for sandwiches or whatever you'd want to use. I also will point out that for the single rise, I did a much more superficial skive with the lame, and that just shows how I barely got through the skin of the bread here, so it's split nicely, but here is much more superficial, and it changes the pattern, but it also changes the shape of the bread. I wanted this loaf of bread to keep the shape that it has, but then it also doesn't expand as large. That does affect that as well. On the second rise loaf and the second loaf we did, I did a much deeper skive. I went through the skin of the bread, but on this side I went even a little bit farther, and it just shows you what happens if you cut farther into the bread loaf. The expansion is greater and it has a little more split to it. So that just shows you the difference between a single rise, a double rise, a superficial skive on using a bread lame or knife or kitchen shear to make the cuts on the top of a bread versus a deeper one. Now for storing these breads, I have these linen bread bags, and these work very nicely because it allows the bread to kind of breathe a little bit and lets a little bit of air in. Otherwise, if it's too constrictive, then sometimes you lose this nice crispy, crusty outside that you have on these breads. I can link in the description box below the various tools and equipment that I used today for this project. If you already are baking bread and you notice some items that maybe you don't have in your kitchen and you like to add, or if you're just getting into the process of bread making, these things help make bread making a little easier and will help you in the process. Well, I hope you're having a great day today and you enjoyed our time together in the kitchen while we bake these rustic Italian breads. Keep watching and there will be more videos in the Hearty Soups and Rustic Breads series. You can check out what other combinations of flavors and what style breads we'll be making together for those. If you're new to the channel, I would appreciate you subscribing. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. See you next time. Take care.